Okay, here we are, Nations in Arms, which probably is the worst grand strategic Napoleonic game I've played. The only possible comparison to it is by the same designer, Napoleon Against Europe. I've blotted that one out of my memory. That was actually a gift from one of my viewers. I blotted that completely out of my memory and remember nothing about it. I tend to, enjoy my grand strategic Napoleonic multiplayer games. But this one just failed across the board. Everything. I mean, the rules are horrendous. I knew that going in. I knew that was going to be a problem. I didn't realize that the second printing of the rules that claimed that they put all the errata in and didn't, because there actually isn't any errata. Basically, if you wanna get the rules for this, you've got to compile them from questions over on Constant World. Nobody compiled the errata as an individual thing. There are two rewrites to the rule set. One of them's a fan-based rewrite that came out earlier, which may be the better of the two, because it wasn't as limited by the rules of the game. However, unless it drastically changed everything in the game and threw out components and stuff, it's kind of questionable. Because one of the big things in the game is there's a series of event cards that, in and of themselves, just don't work, and I don't know if they're even fixable. Maybe they are if they got put into different mechanisms that force discards and stuff like that, so that cards that are unusable by a player or undesirable by a player at least cost them something to hold. So I could see some kind of rule that got around the problem of the cards. Another big factor was this game is written as Valmy to Waterloo, the Wars of Napoleon Bonaparte, 1792 to 1850. Now again, I don't do the research that I should, but I assumed there was a campaign game. There are many campaign games. There's not one that covers the whole period. In fact, the revolutionary period from 1792 until I think 98 is one scenario. Then there's another one for 99, and then there's an 1805 to 1815 and some smaller ones in there. So it just, it failed at this thing that I wanted, right? I was kind of excited by it because I knew that Empires in Arms, which has a revolutionary scenario as an expansion that I have, doesn't allow you to combine them. So I was really hoping for something that allowed you to combine them. This game doesn't allow that, and some of that has to do with the event cards. You would have to put additional event cards in, etc., to get that. Let's get to components, and then I'm going to start dissecting the rules, because my contention is that there is basically not a system in this game that stands on its own merits. I feel like the game is a series of what were thought, what the designer thought were like clever ways to do something without really trying to solve some problem or another. Just sort of, hey, let's try a different mechanism for this. That would be neat, and it just sort of is a bunch of stuff that isn't well designed and developed in and of itself as subsystems slapped together in a system, as a whole game. But I kind of feel like almost every single component of this, every single subsystem in this rules set kind of doesn't work. And there's for a number of reasons. I think I'm going to have to glue this thing together, so I am going to go reload my pipe because I was foolish in thinking that this one would work. Let's start with the box. The initial box that I had shipped to me, I ordered this direct from Compass. When I found out there was a second printing and that it was different, supposedly, I think the only difference was they put in something saying it's different. Like they corrected some stuff. It came with a hole punched in it. Like it had taken some damage in shipping at some point or another. And I'll say this much. They were very good. They replaced the box. So that was cool. The maps, look, there's nothing terrible about them. They cover Europe. They have some off-map boxes, etc. You know, they're colorful. They're usable. The only thing that I really found as a problem with the maps was I really struggled with these army boxes. The ordering they chose for them, etc., was kind of problematic, and the fact that like the name of the armies isn't above them or anything, so you have those boxes pretty full, and it's sometimes hard to see which army you're looking at. You also have to kind of walk around a lot if you're playing solo to get to, to get to information you're going to need on the combat chart. There is one thing that's bad about the map, and I'm going to say it's kind of the same thing I feel is bad about War and Peace's map. It's a hex map with really, really large amounts of space covered in the hexes. And that doesn't really... What I found was that the game didn't really significantly change from an area-based game in terms of what you're actually doing. Yeah, sometimes it's a little bit more fiddly and everything to deal with the hex terrain costs and stuff. There are a couple of cases where you can do some really ahistorical looking stuff with your armies to get some kind of advantage. But for the most part, it was just pile a bunch of pieces in a hex. And in fact, it's worse than War and Peace because at least in War and Peace, there was rules for attrition that kind of incentivized you not to put all your troops in one big stack. This one is not the case, but that's okay. The counters, oh boy, are the counters a problem. First of all, a lot of times you're counting up steps of units, and some of the military counters have only one step, some have two. There's no easy way from looking at the counter to tell whether it is. What I would do is just count the number of face-up counters as 2 steps each, but the problem with that is there are a couple of one-step units that are printed on the front side that looks like a 2-step unit. So basically, with certain units, you kind of have to flip them over to see how many steps they have or whatever. And when you do the combat, the odds chart or the odds ratios are based on how many steps of combat you have in place. Okay. That's a little problematic. You start to learn which ones are different, and usually odds don't matter that much. For the most part, you're having armies hit each other, so usually. Because you want those big stacks. And we'll get to that. That's got some weirdness to it. But then there are dates printed on the leaders in these, looking for one, just along the top here in a little dark colored bar. And if you look at early on when I was dealing with the revolutionary scenario, the ones for the revolutionary scenario are readable. The ones that span both scenarios are readable. The ones for the Imperial era, 1805 on, are essentially unreadable. You have to put them under perfect light and have near perfect vision to be able to see the black print on the dark blue of the counter. WIF had sort of a problem like this too with the British units, but this is the worst. Like, they are almost entirely unreadable. You really have to like scrutinize each counter individually, which is a pain in the ass for sorting. It's a pain in the ass. That indicates when the units come into play, etc. I found I had a lot of difficulty with the national control markers, which, see, they serve too many purposes. They serve a purpose of indicating who controls a fortress, but also who controls provinces. And they're just, by being in that dual purpose, and also they're just not being enough for a lot of the nations. And some of them are kind of weird in the sense that, like, there's ones for minor nations that I guess you could use as provincial control markers in a couple of cases, but it's not really clear that they're needed for that. And it's just, I found myself really struggling with the control markers in this for a number of reasons. I think it would have been best, I don't know. So they use the markers in a way that's kind of similar to how EU uses them, but EU has two sets of markers, one for provincial control and one for fortress control. And if you conquer somebody's fortress, you put a fortress marker on it, and not a control marker for the provinces. There are enough for the provinces. There aren't enough for the fortresses for some of the nations. Nations that maybe aren't expected to do a lot militarily or whatever. Do I have anything else that I really disliked here? I think other than that, the counters were okay. The cav units, so there are cav leaders who barely have an effect on play and don't get bonused by having cav with them. They're just like, they just get a bonus in terms of interceptions and stuff like that, but they don't actually need a cav corps with them, which is kind of funky too. You also have detachments, which are one-step units that are easy to detect. I'm not putting them in with the other one-step units that I've seen, which are like, you know, some nations have their guards or their guard cav as one-step units, stuff like that. I think one nation has a cuirassier as a one-step unit. It's fucking... It's all over the place. It's just like there's no easy way to guess what you're going to see. But if it's something kind of weird, you might want to flip it over and look. But the detachments, those are easy to detect what they are. The problem with the detachments has to do with the rules handling them, which are, like much of this game, really Byzantine. And then there's the minors, which are distinguished. This is a compass-like detail, which are distinguished largely by having a little tiny square at the bottom that has their nation's flag on it. And in a lot of cases, they have colors that, you know, because there are so many minors or whatever, that are the same palette as everything else. And it can be very hard to tell a particular leader or naval unit which nation it's from. Because of that. That can be kind of a pain in the ass. Let's get to cards. The cards are, of course, modern poker quality cards. We have two types. We have the event cards, and I've got more event cards over here, which are sorted by date. It's a kind of weird because the dates are aligned with the scenarios, which means that even if you wanted to work your way into trying to make the grand campaign work somehow, you kind of can't use these cards. You'd have to modify them. But the bigger problem with the cards, in my opinion, is that, first of all, a different number of them is handed out based on whether you're playing a multiplayer game or not, which means more cards get dealt in the multiplayer game, and that can affect like whether or not you get through the deck, how quickly the public events happen and everything. So you basically have some of these are really major things. And you basically have a very different experience depending on how many players you're playing. The game might be best in 2 players for various reasons because the multiplayer rules are really shitty. Oh, there were two rule sets. I told you about the fan-based one that was like essentially a redesign of the game. Then there's the Banania rules, which I did reference a few times for clarifications because I figured they would handle some of the errata in the game, which is basically an attempt to reconcile the rules as written and the answers to questions that came up, I guess, on Concept World in the threads, which in and of itself is a massive job. I didn't use either rule set because I like to have a rule book, and printing one out is an expense and a pain that I did not want to go through. My printer is problematic. And, I want a rule set with the staples in it that works, not something that's like a bunch of loose pages stapled together in the corner. And actually, the Kinko's that was near me, and not really near me, downtown, 45-minute walk, whatever, closed a while back. So I don't even know if there's a printing place. There are 3 sets of there are 3 player aids. One is quite simple. It's just a terrain effects chart. Cool. No problem there. I think it actually is effective and tells you more or less what you need to know from it. The next 2 are more complex. This is your main one, which has a lot of little tables that you're going to have to use for movement in combat and whatnot. But in addition, also has this major power resource chart on the back, which is a pain in the ass because what it does is it tells you the starting points of the income, the commercial usage, and the number of troops, the number of strength points that you can add each year. But the starting points are scenario starting points. I think only campaign scenarios because nothing else has production of the same sort. And what that means is you have to kind of wind back, and in some cases, I think these say you get no money. No, they don't. These are actually not too bad. But they have to be worked in with something on a different player aid. It's cool that it's on a different one, which is a list of all the miners and what their incomes are. And this is more problematic because you again have to kind of roll back from certain times. And in some cases, there's no trade value listed. But that's because of diplomatic situations, which are much more or which are flexible, and you have to kind of, research backwards or something, but in some cases the numbers change. I think for Venice, some numbers change over time. Yeah. The economic value of Venice goes down in 1798 for some reason. That one sticks in my head. It may be the only one that's like that. This other thing also has diplomatic modifiers. Now those are on, there's little chits that have them on them as well for most of the potential minor powers, but not all of them. There are some that don't start the game that don't have chits, that don't start the game as a minor neutral, that don't have chits for whatever reason. That can potentially become minor powers. Okay. This also gives the setup forces, which isn't very well handled in the rules. It's not clear if, whenever that nation is reinstituted, it sets those up. If it doesn't, it's kind of problematic because a nation could switch sides and lose its fleets because of that. But that's, that's minor around the edges type crap. And then you also have a production chart which tells you the costs of all units, and in some cases it calls units by things that they really aren't, and you're going to have to do a little bit of intuiting to figure that out. As well as a replacement of all the trade for all the different ports, which might be useful, but it's printed on the map as well, so it's not that important. And a big differential from Empires in Arms, and I think EU for that matter, but I'm not positive. Big differential from Empires in Arms, which has money and manpower on it. This game kind of works the same way, but what they notably don't have is sort of a per province money and manpower on the map. So instead they use kind of procedural rules to figure that out, but they don't apply for things that happen to be printed in here. So like, yeah, whatever. One thing I haven't mentioned in the cards is the battle cards. These are an option, I think, or it's an option not to use them. They actually work okay. They're a little clunky, but they add some extra excitement and narrative and whatever to the actual battles. Of course, you're doing so much procedural crap in the battles, so much, figuring out modifiers and keeping track of that and all, that it's like you don't really have the time. The battles are mechanically complex enough. You don't really have the time to sort of immerse yourself into the echelons here and try to picture it and everything. You're just so busy keeping track of the modifiers. One of the charts I didn't hit, over here in the chartsies. The inside of this is, you have your combat charts. This is for the battles. This is all the modifiers for the battles. A couple of other things that affect, one that affects combat. You have a siege chart, which you get to roll multiple times in a single movement, possibly. And you have the attrition chart. Interestingly, the attrition chart never charges you attrition for a one-step unit, which means a one-step unit can move a one-step unit can move multiple times in a turn, utilizing force march capabilities. It can extend its movement. Basically, it is immune to any kind of attrition, which feels a little weird because you go to the two-step and there's a fair chance of attrition happening on it. I would much rather something like War and Peace's system, which gives a possibility of a one-step unit taking attrition. You might be able to get enough modifiers that even a 3 to 5 step unit's not going to take attrition. Of course, you always suffer attrition in War and Peace, unless you can get your modifiers down, so that you don't. In this, you only suffer it in certain specific instances, which we will get to. All right. We have the wonderful dice, which are so bad that I'm putting them back in the game. Normally, I steal dice from games. And I'm not a big fan of larger dice like this, but at least like GMT has those nice quality rounded dice. These, I feel like they're from a cheap Monopoly ripoff or something. They're not even as good as what goes there. And then you have two books, the rule book and the playbook. The rule book contains the rules, and they're horrible. I'm not going to go any more than that. Except for it doesn't contain all the rules, because the multiplayer rules are in the playbook, as are the rules for creating nations, creating minor states, and then more multiplayer stuff having to do with victory. And then it has the scenarios, and I think it actually has some examples of play as well. Maybe Yeah, it does have examples of play. Kind of mixed into the scenarios in a weird sort of way, but it's not horrible. I did find that it wasn't terribly easy to set up a scenario based on some of these. Some things are left out as to whether or not something's set up, so it's kind of like just not clear what's going on. Like there are minor powers that don't have any troops listed as set up in there, but there's kind of a why, whereas some of the minors have troops on the board. It feels like it might not be correct. But what about the rulebook itself? Yeah. All right, we're gonna pause and I'll come back because this is gonna take many, many steps. Okay. I have to set the damn date every time I switch the battery on this one, which is obnoxious. So, trying to see where I want to hit specifics on the rules. Much of it is pretty common, so I'm not gonna jump into big pieces of that. But the game uses a chit pull mechanism. Now, I'm not a huge fan of chit pull, but this one's particularly weird. It allows, basically, there are 4 land movement chits for each major, the primary blocks, the coalition and the empire. And we won't worry too much about that. There's some fuzziness about how you get assigned to one of them in the multiplayer rules, but in the core mechanism of the 2-player type concept, you have 4, and they're rated 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if your leader's initiative is equal to or greater than the number of the chit, you're allowed to move one of those units. But you can only move each unit once or a second time if you're force marching it, which is a matter of, you're allowed to move each stack twice, basically, on 2 different chits. But you have to pay an attrition cost, which larger size units really don't want to do, for the most part. I probably underutilize that. Unless I have a really, really key reason to, I don't want to do that. But I knew I was going to get to those really key reasons at the end of the game, potentially, to try to grab territory, and it's kind of fucked up. Anyway, what this means is that you have kind of this, you might get a chit that you're like, I have to use this because my leader's not very good. Although most leaders are going to be 3 initiative, which means they can operate on 3 of the 4 chits. And really good leaders, there are a few of them, and France has a fair amount, can operate on any of the chits. But there's another facet. There's the winter quarters chit. Now, that doesn't go into the cup in summer, but in the other 3 seasons it goes in the cup, which means if it's drawn in the winter, it ends the turn. If it's drawn twice in the autumn, it ends the turn, and 3 times in spring it ends the turn, which makes it feel like it's not really winter quarters at all, right? You're going to see cases of this throughout the playthrough where like something just is named something that it's not. But this creates a really, really strange sort of dynamic around what you want to do. So a lot of times you're going to want to hold off as long as you possibly can to move your units so that you don't telegraph what you're doing. Now sometimes you want to do something right away, and then it's like, yep, got the chit, get to go. But other times you're wanting to hold off as long as you can. But on the other hand, you don't want to get burned out of your activation. So like, you have to kind of play this press your luck against the winter quarters chit. And it creates some really weird dynamics around it that I'm not sure what they represent, right? Like, it doesn't really represent like the idea of forces moving for a while and then winter coming early or bad weather or something like that, cutting the turn short. And the other weird thing is, in particular in the spring, it feels like the bad weather likely comes before you do anything, so you'd know what chits you had beforehand. So, like, again, it's sort of this neat little attempt at being clever that doesn't really represent anything, and I don't think does better than other systems out there do. It does create some interesting gameplay. I'll give it that. I will give it that. But I don't know, how much else. Like, is it more interesting than CDG gameplay or other kind of pulsed games like Civil War or Korean War? I don't know. It's more interesting than a straight I go, you go. It can, through a hand wavy type of way, you can make up what happened in ways that are more believable than the straight I go, you go. But it doesn't feel terribly like it's representing anything in particular. And then once you get away from that, well, it is kind of a cumbersome system. Chit pulls tend to be. It requires paying a lot of attention multiple times as to what you want to move and stuff like that, and what kind of risks you're willing to take that require you to look all over the map regularly. So to me, it's kind of a slightly mechanically expensive situation. And it might be mechanically expensive many times, which is to say that you evaluate everything's position and you don't move anything. It's kind of like Vietnam was, another Victory Games game. Anyway, that's kind of how the initiative pool works. And look, we're not going to worry about, the first chit can't be a winter quarters. There are some other chits in there. There's the naval chits, and then there's also chits for the neutral powers, so that they don't get to do a lot. They don't get as many opportunities to do things. And they might get boned out more easily without any chance. The next major system in the game is stacking. Stacking in this game is so fucked up. It's based on your leadership rating. Kind of makes sense, right? A leader should be able to only command troops in battle up to a certain amount effectively. In terms of commanding and moving large forces, it makes sense that you wouldn't be able to move a large force without adequate command. So that's what they kind of have. And it's based on the number of stars the leader has, all of which works okay, right? So a single unit can move without a leader. A one-star leader can move 2 steps, a 2-star leader 4 steps, a 3-star leader 6 steps, and a subordinate leader. All makes sense if it's movement or if it's some kind of penalty in combat, but it's not. These are the real stacking rules for this game. If you exceed stacking limitations of your leadership, the extra troops disappear, as they would in overstacking under other types of systems, which doesn't make a lot of sense because there's no geographical constraint. Those hexes are big. They can hold a lot of troops, which is shown by this. There's another way of stacking your troops, which is in armies. Armies can hold, in general, somewhere between 12 with a bad leader and 18, well, there might be some that are less than 12, but basically between 12 and 18 steps. And you can have up to 3 armies in a group. And that can all operate together. What's not absolutely clear is whether or not you have any penalty for using Army groups. You do if you pick them up along the way. Maybe you do if they're collected together and you utilize them together. I'm not sure of that. Again, the rules are very bad, right? What does this mean? Well, first of all, there's this incredibly ridiculous thing of like, oh, I've got 2 leaders in the same hex, and one of their forces just goes away. It's just dead, you know? And it's not because there's no supply or anything. It's because they can't coordinate, you know, or something. I guess one of them just commits suicide. I don't know. I mean, you know, you can make the same kind of stupid statements about overstacking in any case. But the stacking rules are just so weird, and they don't represent a damn thing. Much more sensible would be having the stacking rules relate to the amount of force that you could move and maybe the size of force you could have in battle. Maybe. Although, historically, smaller coordinating forces came to one another's aid, and that's not allowed because battle happens in a single hex. And so any kind of interceptions and everything, they're all subject to these same stacking rules. Now, that's going to mean something later in battle, and I'll give it to you now. What you got in the battle is real important. Like how many steps you have, essentially. Okay? First of all, it gives you an odds ratio, which is a modifier, which probably won't be too big unless you're really significantly larger than the enemy force. Now, if you have 5-1, it's an automatic victory and they just go away. Which means one of them little 1-star leaders with no more than two steps can be overrun by just about any army. And a 3-star leader even can be overrun by an army group, right, of 3 armies with no problem. But it goes further than that. You get a lot of modifiers for having more cav, more artillery, better units and some other stuff as well. But you can get up to 4 points of modifiers off of having cav and artillery in combat, which means that between the odds ratio and those modifiers, if you have sort of a mixed balanced force against another mixed balanced force, or approximately, you know, the same kind of composition, you can get a huge advantage out of just being bigger. And what this ends up meaning is that armies scare everything that's smaller than an army away from them, and army groups scare armies away. Because they just, even if they can't reach that 2-to-1 ratio, they can often reach the 2-to-1 ratio in artillery and maybe cav. Cav's a little trickier than artillery, but artillery, armies come with bonus artillery in them. This is weird. It doesn't seem to all of this doesn't seem to really represent anything. It doesn't feel Napoleonic to me. It ends up meaning that maneuver in combat feels very much like it does in Empires in Arms, where it's area movement. All right, and there's really, we'll get to other reasons, but it turns out there's just no reason not to have your units in huge stacks, as far as I can tell. What about sea? Well, sea stacking is a little different. The basic unit in sea units are fleets. You can have up to 3 fleets in a squadron. Feels opposite, you know, feels to me like you could have squadrons in a fleet. But again, that's just, you know, that's just the choice of wording. But it is, again, it's this kind of stuff that it's like, why the hell would you do it this way? Why would you call it that? Each sea area is only allowed to have a stack of 3 friendly fleets in it. which means if I sail out into the English Channel with 3 fleets for the Brits, they can't pass any more navies through the English Channel. And neither could their allies, like let's say the Russians wanted to or something. It's just weird. It's absolutely unbelievable, you know. And it could be the North Atlantic, not the English Channel, right? Anyway, there's complicated rules as to how do you integrate forces as you move them and stuff, all of which kind of makes sense. They're cumbersome and they're painful. I don't mind them. I think they're okay, except where it comes to one particular thing, which is there's a differentiation between simply picking up forces as you walk by them and absorbing them. And I don't know if detachments are the only thing that can be absorbed, but essentially you get different rules if you incorporate units in, if you incorporate strength points, stacking points, whatever, into other units from just picking things up in the stack. And that affects movement, that affects demoralization status, activation status, all kind of weird shit. And it's just like, there's these 2 different rules, and again, I don't see why there's this distinction particularly. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't feel like the game is detailed enough, and even if it were, I'm not sure what it represents that's meaningful. You know, is it easier to incorporate reserves into a core than to attach core together? I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. Check how much battery I'm eating. I bet you I can't tell. I can't tell. Hold on. Okay, let's keep going through this exercise. It's kind of fun because, I mean, look, I complained throughout playing, but yeah, so like I was saying, there's all this special rules around detachments in particular, where they don't get an activation leader level unless they're commanded by a leader. If they move on their own, they don't get one, which means that even if they join another force without integrating, they still don't pollute it. But they're not allowed to be in armies for some reason. And it's very hard to see the reason why. There are a couple of little game effects to that can pretty much be worked around. And it's mechanically painful. So again, there's just, you know, shit that's here as if it was stuck in to patch against somebody's objection or something, without really considering the weight that it adds to the game or the value, which is basically nothing. Like, anyway. Actual land movement. Look, this is pretty simple, okay? Like the terrain effects chart, it kind of works. There was one thing that I should have mentioned with the map. There are a couple of rivers that are kind of hard to see. That happens, but, you know, the map is pretty readable for the most part, but, you know, one thing that's not particularly easy to see is the victory point hexes, which only really matter in the in the campaign, the multiplayer campaigns. I don't find that too bad because there's a list of them, so I'm just not that worried about it. Now they have a rule. I mean, this is the kind of thing, and this is where the rules aren't wrong, but they're just badly managed. I just see this one here. Units can move only when commanded by a leader. Exceptions. Cossacks, Turkish feudal units, and guerrillas, fine. Detachments and corps can move on their own, but with a provisional initiative of 1. They have additional restrictions on them though. So okay, I don't know. It just, again, it feels like, yeah, why? Okay. The chart for evasion, I think, might also be initiative, interception. No, the chart for evasion. So it gives these big bonuses, like Cossacks and guerrillas get a +5 bonus, but there's a net modifier limitation of 3 in any direction on that chart. Generally, it's pretty easy to get to 3. So pretty much no matter who the leaders are, unless they're really outclassed, you end up with, again, most leaders are value 3. You end up with a +3, so you get an avoidance check on 7 or more. It just feels like, I don't know, it's just annoying to me. All right. So again, there's an overrun, which is available. Oh, I cheated. Just saw something. I allowed overruns inside fortresses. I don't know how much difference it made. There were battles I didn't have to roll for that probably wouldn't have fallen as quickly. The fortresses were falling too quickly, and that's actually a complaint I had, so I was screwing that up. But yeah, basically you can march through an enemy force, and if it doesn't evade you, if you have 5-to-1 step odds, you just wipe it out. Which, okay. I mean, I'm not terribly upset by that, but again, it doesn't give any opportunity for like, there's interception opportunities. But again, stacking prevents small forces from combining into anything decent size. So you end up with putting your biggest force forward. Is there something else? I talked about the naval rules. Again, it's the stacking that kills them. But, you know, I mean, we're basically looking at everything in the game has problems. Supply. This is the next big section of the rules. So, if your units are out of supply at the moment that you activate them, or for the defender when he's being attacked, or at the end of combat, for the phasing player, you have to make a supply check. And if you're not going to attack somebody when you're out of supply. There's a big modifier for being out of supply. So you don't want that to happen. And you try very hard not to have that happen. You check supply. You check attrition. Let me see. Now, for some reason, at the end of combat resolution for the phasing player, supply is assessed, but it's not clear what happens under those circumstances. Because, although you wouldn't fight a battle when you're out of supply. But a force checks supply when it's out of supply, when it's activated, or before the battle. Not after, where it says over here. So I think there may be like a rules problem there. It makes sense. So what happens, the way I played it, is if a force is out of supply, it would have to check at the end of its movement, and that's actually handled here, or if it's activated for a second time, or, yeah, they kind of say it here. The attrition check takes place before battle, but you're not checking that they're in supply after the battle. That's the thing I don't get. Like, I think there's something wrong there. But yeah, I followed the attrition check rules, which basically, at the end of your movement, if you started out of supply, or before a battle, if you started out of supply, you have to check for attrition. And you don't want to take attrition. You also have to check for attrition if you use extended movement, which is sort of what other games call strategic movement or something, where you speed things up because they're not near the enemy. Seems really odd that, like, yeah, you're able to march fast. Like, if you want to march faster than you would when you're in contact with the enemy, you have to take an attrition check for it. That feels weird. I mean, you can kind of make an argument for it, but it just feels weird. And then if you don't activate a unit and it was out of supply, it has to check for supply as well. Also, demoralized units, whether or not they were activated, have to check for supply, as do besieged units. And they check an attrition check for that. But what's really interesting is, here's what I guess could happen. You march into battle. This is the only reason why you'd have to check supply after battle. You march into battle, you fight a battle, you win the battle so that you still have movement points. You have to make another supply check to make sure that you're still in supply after that battle. Normally, that's not a big deal. Normally, though, you also make sure your forces stay in supply. You don't run them away from the supply line. Now, because of the limitations of when attrition checks happen, you can have as big a force as you like, as long as it just moves at 6 movement points or whatever. Now, here we come to one of the weird things. Supply wagons. The French supply wagons move just like infantry. They have a 6 movement point allowance. That's great. Maybe someone else does. Maybe the Brits do. I don't know. But everyone else has a 4 movement point allowance, which means that the only way that they can keep up with their army is using extended movement, which requires an attrition check. But you can dispatch a leader out of the army to command that supply wagon and move it to 6 movement points, and it's only a half a step, so it won't take any attrition check at all, which basically means they all kind of have 6 movement points capability. It's a little funky. It does have an effect, but it's like this really cumbersome system that's not well explained, and you really kind of have to think about it to figure out how you're going to manipulate your supply wagons to get them to work exactly like they would, because you're not going to be extended marching your units normally. It does mean they can't move next to enemy units and stuff at the higher speed. So, I mean, it does have some impacts, but they're really, really limited. In addition, how do you chain your supply in this game? What is your supply line? Well, your supply line consists of going from a source, which is basically a fortress in your home or an allied country, and every 4 hexes you have to have a fortress that you control, or a supply depot, or a detachment. Not a strength point, not a step, a detachment. Now, it's pretty easy to make detachments, but some countries don't have very many. That fucks up their supply. The Turks, for example, have like 2 detachments. Other countries have shit tons of them. But again, this is weird. It's one of the few effects that not being allowed to have attachments in armies really has an impact, because what it means is that armies can't be supply hexes unless they have a depot in them, which they usually do, but whatever. All right. What about combat itself? Okay. Combat is one of the few things in this game that I found cumbersome and painful, but not particularly unbelievable, except for how the stacking and force coordination works in conjunction with it. Basically, um, you know, a couple of non-army leaders are just not going to cooperate with each other. I could see there having to be a cooperation check or something like that, but just being an all-out, they can't cooperate unless they can legally stack, and what that means is like you can't get a larger force. That is really hard to believe. Like, my knowledge of Napoleonic era, it just doesn't cover it. It's not like, you know, you had some kind of official army level of organization. You had theater, you know, you had regional commands and whatnot, but somebody was always in command. It was very seldom the case where there was like some kind of impediment to coordination between forces, and you know, at a major level. Now, like I said, it would make sense if you had to make some kind of coordination roll to exceed your stacking limitations, or you had some sort of penalty for the forces or something like that. But it doesn't work that way. It works with simple stacking rules that are, if you're overstacked, you die. Which just means, you know, you can't use some of these rules like marching to the sound of guns, because your forces are always full up. The way morale works in this game, instead of like a game like Empires and Arms or EU, which averages morale, instead of a somewhat more reasonable, something like the median, nope. You have many different morale numbers, and it is the morale number that you have the most steps of. Which means I might have like, I don't know, let's say three steps of militia, that's morale 2. 2 steps of regular French infantry, that's morale 4. 2 steps of guard, that's morale 5. Guess what? I'm morale 2. Now, you can juggle your troops and you can pretty much keep that from being a problem, but it is this cumbersome thing that's added to it, where there would be much easier ways where you just like, you could pretend something's a level lower or whatever, you know, just in order to be able to do that. Now, you have, in major battles, you use these tactical cards. Like I said, I don't have a lot of problems with them. The selection of them has to do with the leadership quality and everything. It works okay. You could get shafted or whatever, but it produces a nice... I have absolutely no problem with that. In order to get additional cards, you have to commit a leader and risk him to death. I felt like leader casualties, I don't know, they came from weird places. Like, small forces were really unlikely to get leader casualties when facing one another. And also, there's no rules at all about being overrun, whether you take a casualty check or not. I just put one in. But anyway. One of the factors that you're able to do is you're able to commit a lead unit to the battle. Now, you don't have to do this. And the lead unit's morale level is the modifier in the battle. Now, there is one weird exception to this, which is if you have only one unit in the combat, its morale modifier has to be used, even if it's negative. So this is the thing. You have militia and stuff. If militia are on their own, they're penalized. But if two militia are stacked together, they're not, which is just weird. Like, I don't know if that's intended, but it's like normally you don't have to pick a lead unit. And again, it's just like everything's fucking broken in this game. I didn't see the 3-to-1. Oops. At the end of combat, the enemy retreats. The loser retreats, assuming he has anything left. And then has to make a demoralization check. If he's demoralized, he's immune. He takes a pursuit loss for the battle, but he runs away from any additional battles. However, you can do some really gamey stuff to prevent him from running away by, like, surrounding him. Stuff that just does not look right at the scale of the game, but yeah. Rallying doesn't bother me. You spend movement points and you make a die roll, and you might get undemoralized that way. Of course, becoming undemoralized means now you're vulnerable to being attacked again. You already lost a battle. You probably took more losses. You're probably not in good shape. But if you don't undemoralize, you're going to take attrition losses at the end of the turn. Again, it's kind of a weird trade-off that's interesting and everything, but I don't know what it really means. Yep, it's the end of the month. You were demoralized the day before the end of the month. Therefore, you take attrition losses. But if you were demoralized early in the month and then waited until the very end of the turn to undemoralize, you don't take attrition losses for it. Yes, there's turn barriers and stuff, but I just don't understand what this is meant to represent, this whole thing. And it just doesn't, it's more of that, okay, you made some complicated and interesting and new and innovative decisions on how to do things and little systems, little ones, that they just don't make sense. Just like the bigger ones don't make sense, and you made them interesting and everything. Like, they provide no advantage over things that are much, much simpler or much, much more familiar to us. One or both of those. Anyway, we're going to pause there, see what else I can find to bitch about, because we're going to bitch a lot here. All right, let's keep going with this shit. Sieges. I don't think, I think I found a system that I don't mind here. It's not bad. You spend movement points equal to the size of the fortress. You get to roll on a little table, and you get a result. The only real problem with sieges, such as there is one, and there's a problem with everything in this game, basically, is the honors of war don't work on the garrison. You don't get the garrison back for that. You do get any troops that happen to be there, and here there's just a rules issue, during the spring interphase, which may or may not happen only in springtime. The spring interphase happens every turn, and that's the problem. But anyway, that's something that presumably got answered in questions somewhere or another. Although it seems like in some cases it makes more sense. The things that happen in the spring interphase happen once a year, and in others, not so much. The honors of war returns probably should not take a whole year, but other things might. The other problem is once you succeed in a siege, you can garrison the fortress, or the fortress remains ungarrisoned and essentially has no effect on play. If you garrison the fortress, you can put one of your troop steps in it, pretty much anything you like, but you lose it. if you have the other option of spending a couple bucks. Now, money has its own problems and how it's handled and everything. But if you have money saved up from the spring, it's not the spring interphase, it's the reinforcement and replacement phase of the spring term, or the economics phase, depending on how you want to look at it. You produce the money in the economics phase, you spend it during the reinforcement and replacement. But what's weird here is the manpower that you use costs a combat unit to create. The money doesn't. But on the charts and tables, replacing a garrison takes manpower and money. But you don't have manpower at any time other than during the economics phase. There's no way to track it or anything. So it's like, what I ended up doing was just saying, look, if you want to spend money, you can at any time other than during the reinforcement phase without worrying about manpower. I don't know if that's what's intended, but here's the thing, again, you don't get that manpower back for the garrison, nor the money for that matter, when you get an honors of war situation. So it just, like, there are just problems in it. Anyway, the siege works okay. Naval battles are kind of fucked up. You roll a number of dice equal to the number of fleets you have. Remember, that can never be more than 3 because that's the stacking limitation per sea area or port or blockade box. You get bonuses equal to the combat value. The whole handling of fleets is weird because each fleet has basically a leader. And if the leader dies, that fleet can never be rebuilt. But otherwise, it can be built. Again, just doesn't feel right, and it's like, why have this weird mechanism in place? And it also means that you have to juggle which fleet is where very carefully, as opposed to just repositioning your leaders, which you can kind of do at will. Now, I understand the reason for it. It has to do with countermix, probably. But it's like this really fucked up Byzantine system that doesn't add anything to the gameplay that's good. It creates weird shit, that's all. The actual naval combat, look, odds are a big deal because each fleet adds a die, whereas commanders aren't going to add more than 2, I think Nelson adds 3 points. So, you know, Nelson is about equal to a die, but even the very best commanders aren't going to be equal to a die. So it basically ends up being who has the most fleets, but it's highly random. And a lot of the systems in this game are pretty random. I don't mind that at all. Naval combat in harbor, you almost never do that except in a naval invasion, and it's pretty trivial in that case because the harbor basically gives you a die. With some bonuses, whereas your invasion is probably going to be 3 fleets going in. I mean, why not? The biggie with the naval leaders, whenever a fleet gets destroyed, you roll 2 dice, and on a 12, it's gone forever. So it's not very likely you're going to lose many fleets. Your force pool is going to stay pretty big unless you get really, really unlucky. But it's a big deal for some of the smaller fleets, maybe. Like if they get attacked. You also have decoy fleets, which just disappear. They're fairly cheap. They cost $5. It's not that cheap. I don't know what the hell they're meant to represent. Like something that you had to pay that much money for that's like basically ghosts. You know, I mean, I understand why there should be decoy fleets because you don't really know what's where. But like the idea of it being an expended disinformation that actually moves around, wow, that just doesn't comport with reality at all. Corsairs, those work okay. We won't complain about them. Okay. The events deck. This thing is a fucking mess. It is a nightmare. Okay? So the game wants to put event driven type stuff like CDGs and whatnot have in them. So a significant number of important major events are put in one shot public cards that must be played sort of as soon as possible, but there's a whole bunch of, again, weirdly restrictive Byzantine rules as to, who can play what when, depending on blocks and whatnot. And again, the number of players makes a big difference. If you're playing with 7 players and not a lot of people are aligned, they all have to play any public events they get. But if they are aligned, each block can only play one public event per turn. In addition, there's another rule which prevents more than one foreign war from being played in a given year. Not per block, just more than one across the board. Which means you can kind of engineer not having a foreign war based on what other random public events you have. I mean, these really are things that are outside the player's control for the most part, right? And you have to kind of intuit, decide, whatever, how blocks interact with the player order and whatnot as to who's forced to play when and where. Also, each player gets a different number. Well, each player gets one card, and France and Britain are exceptional. France gets 2 cards, but they can lose them. Both. I'm sorry, Britain gets 2 cards, but they can lose them both. France gets 2 cards, but could get up to 5. These come to you every year. What we saw in my playing was France was holding a big portion of the deck of cards that they didn't want to play and weren't forced to, that only helped the enemies, whatever. Basically, both sides have cards that they absolutely don't want, and that if they end up in that player's hand, they will never get played, and they will never end up back in the discard pile because there's no hand limit or anything like that. That means that in a large number of players, the very sort of pulsing of the deck is different, which is to say the more players there are, the more likely there are things that will end up in people's hands that don't want to play them. First of all, because more cards are dealt out. And if a lot of the cards are in people's hands, that means the public events all come out. And they're also dealt in a weird order. So like Spain gets their card first, then Turkey, then Prussia, Austria, Russia. Then France gets their big pile of cards, then Britain. This means if the deck gets small enough, Britain gets no cards. France may get no cards. But France might get a whole ton of cards. And it's just like the whole pulsing of all these sort of events that are meant to reflect, the big ground-shaking things that happen in the world, especially in the revolutionary scenario. Although I don't know if that even handles more than 2 players. Like, the victory conditions don't, so it's kind of weird. But the rules seem to allow for it, which makes it even weirder. Like, the full diplomacy is not precluded from it. I don't know. Okay. Here we're going to the diplomacy, and I mean, the card deck is just really problematic. On top of that, it's missing cards that would be necessary to make the game work right. So things like the Polish partitions, those and some other cards might make a campaign game possible from 1792 to 1815. But they were left out. and just made sort of scripted things that happen or have already happened. The Egyptian campaign also, it's in one scenario, but it's not triggered or anything, and it would just be perfect within a card. A lot of things in this game would work well with cards, if the cards worked well. Or some kind of mixed card and event type system like Clash of Monarchs uses, which I think actually would work better. A huge portion of the cards are kind of bleh. I mean, they're really weak, and maybe you get the right circumstances you'd want to play them. And again, an even larger portion of them are things that at least one player would never want to play. So, you know. A lot of them end up never getting played, is basically what happens. All right. Diplomacy for the two-player game is different from the multiplayer game. The multiplayer game, the players have their own agency, and it brings in all its own problems. In the two-player game, there's kind of interesting diplomacy that seems like it would work. I didn't get to play it in the 1805 scenario, where countries can fall out of the coalitions and stuff like that, which is kind of neat. But the minor powers are really weird. I mean, everything starts out kind of neutral, except for a few minors that are assigned at the beginning of the game, of any given scenario. You pay some money, you roll some dice, you get some modifiers. It feels a lot like either Empires in Arms or EU in terms of that kind of thing. A little more clumsy. You're not allowed to diplomatize as much as you like. You're limited to one free attempt, which is really, really unlikely if you don't spend money. So it's not all that free. And then one that you have to spend extra for to get a shot at. And if you succeed, it seems like the country is sort of aligned with you until everybody does their diplomacy. They might knock it back out of your hands with their own die rolls, and it's done in that same player order that I listed. Once countries are aligned, though, they can't be taken away, with the exception of countries that are aligned with France that aren't the special things that fit as French satellites, which work like everybody else's minors do, as far as I can tell. That's the only way I can justify these rolls. In addition, you can do diplomacy on major powers, and this is how, non-player countries or the two-player game or whatever are handled. All right, we're going to break there and get to the economics. But the net effect in the 7-player game of the minor diplomacy is all the minors get scooped up. And honestly, this happens in all the Napoleonic games, basically, except maybe Napoleonic Wars, which allows you to boot things into neutral. Until they're conquered or whatever, EU handles minors in a much better way, as does Napoleonic Wars, the CDG. And I think Age of Napoleon does as well. And I have no idea about the other game by this designer because, again, I have totally blocked it from my memory. I can't remember anything. I know I played it. I know it was bad. I don't know if it was worse than this. It's just like, but it was bad enough I didn't want to remember it, and I think I'll remember this. I don't know which one that makes it worse. I think I quit it, that one, much earlier. So, yeah, I mean, the minors suffer from the same kind of effect. There are a few cards that or there is a card that allows you to bump a minor and take it over, which is kind of a cool card. Which allows for things like Sweden changing sides and stuff like that, which I think historically happened. The major power rolls, actually it has a kind of cool rule in it, which I don't see here, so it must be somewhere else, which has to do with sort of how much punishment the major power takes, it slowly leaves the coalition, and then you can pay to bring it back or whatever, or to get it more involved, etc., by giving it loans, which is kind of a cool little mechanism. But the other is just, I mean, again, it's an overly complicated system compared to what something like Empires and Arms has. It has these weird special cases like the satellites, which aren't really a special case because they work like miners for everyone else. And then the French normal miners, which aren't the special case, have their own little rules where you can somehow disassociate them, but not the first year that they join. It's just, again, Byzantine attempts to like take care of some special cases that it just doesn't feel like the game is detailed enough to handle. Anyway. All right, let's keep going, I guess. What about the economics? Okay. So, this game uses an economic system where money and manpower are accounted for, much like Empires and Arms does. In addition to those, it adds one nice thing, which is the force pool. There's a limited size of army for every nation. This is something that War and Peace did as well. And you can make an argument that War and Peace kind of abstracts away the money and manpower with their production cities and whatnot. Feels a little funky because manpower isn't really accounted for. Britain can kind of float other people what essentially comes down to manpower for that. But the force pool is there, so it serves as sort of a limitation. This one, I think, gets this right in terms of the base concept. The implementation is a pile of shit, though. Mainly because of the amount of work that you have to do, working from the baseline of your scenario and then trying to, work through a changelog to to figure out who owns what and what money they make and whatever. It also doesn't break things down as nicely as Empires and Arms does, for good or ill. The force pools feel like they get filled out really quickly. Like, you generally can reach your force pool limits within the course of a year after a defeat. And there's nothing like Empires and Arms' peace condition, which destroys the army. So you usually have a working army. Your army's usually about half size when you lose a war. And, it's recoverable. It's recoverable in too quick a fashion. You don't see the kind of fallow periods. The fallow period is determined really, for peace, is determined really only by the mandatory peace condition, the amount of time that the peace is required. But it's the mechanical issues, which I went over, I think, in the components more, that are problematic, and it's just a real pain in the ass to get them, to get it right. The actual reinforcement phase is after you buy your units in production. Production is done as part of the economics and budget phase, which only occurs in the spring, as opposed to the spring interphase, which happens every turn. It's part of the spring interphase, but yeah. What did I have? I had something here. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to boats. because production of ships is actually an interesting thing. So here, again, you're limited by your countermix of the fleets. Maybe sensible. Fleets are very expensive to make, so really it's going to be hard for anyone but Britain. Well, I mean, Prussia and Austria don't start with fleets, so they can build their fleets pretty, if they have extra money or whatever, they end up building their one fleet each, which doesn't do them a damn bit of good anywhere except maybe as part of the coalitions. But yeah, really only Britain has the money for a fleet. You have the option to try to outrace them with the French, but good luck with that, man. France is richer, but they need to keep replacing losses in the field. But the one place where the fleets really don't work well is in miner production. You're only allowed to give £6, $6, whatever, to each miner. Or maybe it's to the total of your miners, I don't know, to the total of other countries, whatever. But you're not allowed to transfer a lot of cash from like France to Holland or something like that. Which means that none of the miners can build fleets unless they're owned by Britain. Britain has a special exemption to this where they can give money in unlimited amounts to any country. And it is of value to Britain, to build minor fleets because they get a little bit off the cost. I feel like anybody should be able to fund a fleet for a miner. It's one of the few ways France might be able to compete with Britain for total naval superiority. But whatever, the rules are clear on it. They're just unpleasant. And I think that there are nations... I'm trying to think if there were any created nations or stuff that only France could create that wouldn't have a fleet. I don't think so. Okay. During the actual reinforcement phase. So, this is kind of weird. This happens every turn, as opposed to the production. Which is one of the reasons that I feel like troops that come out of honors of war or that come back from a foreign war should be deployable any turn, because the reinforcement phase kind of doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise. Because you can't build troops except during the production phase when you have manpower. At the same time, during the reinforcement phase, you're basically, as far as I can tell, although it's worded in a really complex sort of way, able to move your leaders around however you like, as long as you keep your units in stacking conditions. And if you don't, you just destroy the units. But they go through a lot of effort to tell you that. So I don't have a lot of, I feel like they were trying to do something else, or the designer was trying to do something else, but it's just not there. Okay, let's go to conquests. So, most games have sort of simple conquest rules. Hey, you take the capital of a miner, you get it. It's conquered and it's destroyed. Major powers, maybe you need something more. This game does something much weirder. Minor countries can only be conquered during the winter, once a year. You can overrun them, you can capture their stuff, they still exist, their troops are on the board and everything until the winter. Except, we got to have an exception to that. If the minor has more than one province, it can be conquered in between, but only partially. And then it becomes a neutral. And it's just, again, it's like, what are you doing here? Major powers, on the other hand, can be conquered on any turn that they meet the conquest requirements. In addition, they can also make free peace proposals, which appear to be completely unlimited. But if you're conquered, you have two different kinds of peace that you can give. Well, not really. Empires in Arms allows, essentially you offer a surrender in Empires in Arms, and the opponent can say, no, I want an unconditional or a bigger surrender, and you might be forced into that bigger surrender. And there really aren't a lot of peace choices. There's a minor piece, a major piece, and then a white piece that transfers nothing. In this, you have a piece which gives 4 peace conditions. Now, some of the things that you take can cost you 2. And this is actually problematic because coalitions. It's not clear how a coalition divides up peace conditions. Like if you want a 2-point peace condition, how you go about getting that in terms of timing and whether or not you can get it. No more than 3 provinces can be taken. That includes minor powers and whatnot. Okay. The exception is there's a more major piece, which is if you're defeated and would be forced to surrender, but choose not to. And then what is it? I think yeah, you've got 2 turns to try to fix things. And if you're still defeated at the end of those 2 turns, then you have to pay for a major piece, which is 8 conditions instead of 4. I like the Empires in Arms situation better. It gives kind of this negotiation where maybe you say, look, okay, I'll surrender unconditionally, given that you do these things, you take these picks, whatever, and the players aren't bound by any agreements of that nature, but players usually, especially in a long game where your word becomes sort of important and people aren't going to be eliminated, people tend to keep to the agreements that they make. Here, though, you have no choice in the matter. You surrender and you give, the other person just gets to choose. There are 4 choices. And you only surrender based on being forced to. It's not as pleasant, but it's okay. But what's really weird about the whole thing is on top of all of that, there's essentially a negotiated peace which allows you to do anything at all. With no restrictions on kingmaking or whatever, which could really cause issues, I guess. But the main thing is also, you can actually, I believe, destroy a major power by taking all their provinces. Now, I think it's actually possible to take the way I read it, it looks like it's possible to take the major power's capital before you take everything else even. All kind of weird shit like that I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I buy into any of this. There's definitely room for this to be polished up and make more sense. The idea of any of the major powers being completely destroyed is difficult to accept in the course of the Napoleonic Wars. Why? Because it didn't happen. Okay. But, could the Habsburgs have collapsed? Possibly. Possibly. I think it's a lot harder to convince me that that some of the other options were as possible. The game doesn't actually take that into account, though. But to be honest, if certain reforms hadn't been taken, the Habsburg Empire might have fallen apart on its own. And in that case, like an Austria might well have simply become a minor under those conditions. So, I don't know. The actual conditions, okay, we got problems here too. We got the territorial concessions. We have war indemnities, which almost don't matter because, again, you can pretty much rebuild your war losses up to your force pool limits pretty damn quickly. So a bunch of extra money isn't going to help you. It could help you with navies if you wanted to build navies. it could increase your capability of that. But otherwise, it's not very valuable, and you're not allowed to save money. That's a big deal in this game. One that I feel I have certain problems with as well. But simply because I feel like the money you shouldn't be able to save money ad infinitum like you can in Empires and Arms. But on the other hand, feel like you should be able to stash money for a rainy year to some extent. You can take military aid, which is pretty pathetic. It's pretty pathetic in Empires and Arms too. Here it's a couple of core. Establishing the continental system. This is really problematic because the establishment of the continental system is not properly defined in this rule set. It is in that second, the Banania rule set, which was an attempt to correct and work the errata in, which somehow didn't come in the second printing that says it did. You can increase the amount of time that there's a mandatory peace, which I believe applies to both sides. You can force a mandatory alliance, which counts as 2 peace conditions, can't usually be done, and the big deal of it is that you have access through the enemy's territory. Okay. I think I kind of fucked that one up in play. What it doesn't do is bring you into war or whatever, as far as I can see. But the idea of alliance sounds like it should, which is weird. And historically, you could put it under the military aid, but historically there were alliances that were forced on Austria and Prussia by France. They declared war. Could be the core on loan, though, as something of that nature. Oh, how are we doing time-wise? Let's see. All right, that's not too bad. We'll keep going for a little bit longer. Okay. Then there's a sequence of special rules. The foreign wars, again, they're handled in a clunky fashion. I don't see why, if the U.S. goes to war with Britain, that would have any impact on whether or not Turkey and Russia go to war in the East, or something like that. I mean, but there's this limitation of no more than one foreign war can be drawn per year. It's weird. And then when they show up, as far as I can tell, like the honors of war, they show up the next turn, like when the foreign war is done. So even if you're off in India or something, you can ship the troops back to home territory in, a month, whatever, which is a little short, but hey. There's a special rule on Turkish instability, which is almost nothing. It basically forces some of their leader counters to change. And then there's a chance for them to get knocked out of any wars that they're in with a complete white peace that nobody has any say about, which is really hard to believe. If the Turkish underwent some kind of coup or something, I don't know that would force somebody out of their country who's attacking them without any peace conditions or anything. Feels really fucking weird, and it's like a lot of this. There are national uprisings, which strangely I did not. They're supposedly created by random events printed on the event card. I didn't see any except maybe the Spanish one. I don't know if I was missing something. Maybe there were some in the revolutionary scenario. I don't think so there either. At least not for major powers. So I don't know. Again, I think the event deck, I think some really fucked up stuff went. I get the feeling that the game was designed to be 1792 to 1815. And then things started getting cut back, which honestly the whole game should have been cut back. It should have never been published. The rules are in such bad shape that it never should have made it through playtesting. And presuming there's a developer, Compass doesn't generally have developers. Nope, of course not. Yeah. So the developer's job is to make sure that the company doesn't like spill egg all over themselves. Make sure that this game is actually ready for publication. When you don't have one of those, when you don't have someone who's an advocate for the company and the players and whatnot outside of the designer, you got a real problem. And if you're just relying on the designer to say, and production between the two, it's kind of like software. There's a, hey, is it ready? No, but we could give you some shit. Okay, it's an unacceptable situation. Conceivably, playtesters could stand in some kind of position sort of like that, but you really want somebody who stands with the developer role, who can say, look, we got enough questions and problems coming from the playtesters. It's just not working, and someone who makes the decision of this game doesn't get published because it's just not making it, or yeah, we really want to publish it, but it needs another couple of years of buffing, whatever. But the truth of the matter is, even when they answered tons of questions on this horrendous rule book and made the claim that they incorporated that errata, it just didn't even happen then. I get the this is an era of Compass when they made a really bad name for themselves. For a few years back, around 2015, I felt like they were putting out some decent games. And now it feels like they've reverted again. Maybe I just got lucky, with a few of my choices or whatever. But it really feels like the quality of games. And honestly, it's not just Compass. GMT is going downhill too. In the past 4 or 5 years, their whole quality is dropping. I'm kind of in a position where I'm like, yeah, I don't want to buy new games from most of these companies. They're just not worth it. They're just not worth it. But anyway, we've got these national revolts. Then after that, and not under it, we have Spanish instability, which is this really fucked up weird rule, which might work in the two-player game, but it really kind of doesn't work in the multiplayer game because Spain can change their alliance no matter what. And it's fucked up. That's all I have to say. It doesn't work. And then there's a liberation war, which requires someone to be occupying Spain to work and is a big deal in the victory conditions. And I can't imagine why it requires France to be occupying Spain. And I can't imagine why France would want to occupy Spain in the game. There's just no real value to it. And in fact, the French troops that were in Spain that instigated this were actually allies to the Spanish at the time. But yeah, whatever. We got Turkish feudals. That rule's okay. The Australian Frontier Corps, that's okay too. The Landwehr are just additional production. They're not actual militia being added, which is funny because Prussia and Austria have no militia in their countermix. So the Landwehr aren't really Landwehr at all. They're just, you can build guards with them if you want, which is funky. Like I said, there's a lot of these cases where things are just misnamed. Okay, optional rules. There's this alliance credit. This is the kind of this is something that I think is really cool in the two-player game. It only works there. Where basically, whenever a major power takes defeats of sorts, losses of cities, losses of miners, whatever, its willingness to continue the war decreases. And once it gets down to zero, they must sign a peace with their enemies. Now, what's interesting there is they don't say what. I'm assuming they surrender, I guess, but it doesn't specify that. And it could be judged a lot of things. It's only in a two-player game, and these are powers that aren't one of the two players. So, I mean, it could be a white peace that they offer. It could be a lot of things. I don't know. I don't know what the intention is. That might be in the revisions and questions. Who knows? They have special rules for the Imperial Guard. This is really interesting. The Imperial Guard, the old Guard, has a morale of 6. You will never be able to use that morale as your base morale for a unit. I mean, unless you have it like stacked with another unit. You could have it stacked with the Imperial Guard Cav. You could have like a pure Guard unit, basically, that's very small. But you're usually using them in armies. They have nice artillery. They have nice first unit bonus of +3, which is amazing. If you choose to use it as a spearhead, though, and you lose the battle, it changes the demoralization check. This doesn't reflect the kind of Waterloo type thing, which is that the Guard breaks, so the army breaks. And I think other games handle that much better. They have an option to water down. They have some options that are interesting, but they don't do a whole hell of a lot. What about victory conditions? Okay, we're sticking with the two-player game here. These work. They go to the, well, okay. The automatic French victory happens if Britain is conquered, which is one of multiple conditions that are required in the multiplayer game. But in the two-player game, if you conquer Britain, you win. Or, if you have the continental system in effect for at least 2 winter turns, this is an undefined term. Kind of is defined in the Banania rules, so I'm assuming there was a question about this. But yeah, because by the establishment of the rules, it's either always in effect after 1805, as long as France is at war with England, or it's always, it's in effect once one major power surrenders and the continental system is picked as a peace condition. Neither of those are what was taken in the Banania rules, so take that as you will. And the correction in the Banania rules is not good, because it doesn't allow basically Turkey is allowed to not be part of the continental system, and Scandinavia can be not part of it. Everything else has to be conquered, and then it comes down, or has to be included in it. And then it comes down to this, yeah, but why? You know, what's the difference between Spain and Turkey in terms of their economic impact on Britain especially? Anyway. In 1813, winter 1813 or later, France has defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and is allied to or has defeated Spain, and all are at peace with France. It gives an automatic victory. That one's not included over here. I think it should be. It would make sense. It's weird. It's like they changed the victory conditions entirely. Anyway, the automatic French victory conditions in this are much easier than they are in the multiplayer game. Take that as you will. I think they should be the same. I really do. But anyway. The coalition wins if they conquer France, so forget about a Waterloo type scenario there. And if an automatic victory doesn't happen, France wins if they control themselves and the Grand Empire, which is sort of stuff that they took over during the Revolutionary period for the most part and incorporated into France. Actually, they only have to control, so it could be minors that are aligned with them, I guess. Failing that, the coalition wins. Now, That is totally different from the multiplayer rules. France did not achieve those, would not be able to achieve those conditions in the game I played, yet they had an easy victory. One that could not be stopped in the last year and a half of the game, basically. You kind of want some kind of, I don't know, parity between the victory conditions of the multiplayer and the two-player game. You want them to reflect the same general concept. It just doesn't here. It just doesn't. I like these victory conditions in the two-player game. I despise the ones here. The ones here create so many problems. I think this game, if you throw out the multiplayer aspect of this, the game goes a long way towards getting better because a lot of additional problems get added here. But still, let's look at it. Every fucking subsystem in this game, damn near, is so problematic. Like, you're basically saying, let's take a game like War and Peace, which works okay in two players as well, and make it a lot worse. Let's add a lot of stuff that's different and weird in it, and that just doesn't work. Doesn't do anything to add to the historicity. Yeah, the money and manpower is kind of interesting. The chit pull kind of causes some interesting stuff now and then, but not really believable. Basically, every fucking system in this game is just rotten. You know? Like, I don't know what could have possibly convinced someone that this game needed to be produced. It's inferior to War and Peace by far, which we will get to at some point if I live long enough. We're hoping I don't because we're seeing signs. But it's clearly inferior to Empires in Arms as a multiplayer game. Empires in Arms is a really interesting multiplayer game with a lot of ahistorical weird play, but this tops the weird ahistorical play. It doesn't improve on that. It doesn't make it any better when you get to that 7-player game or whatever. This is much, much worse. Like, we will get to this and what happens in here. But this is just horribly ruined for that. This has these weird fucking event cards and stuff that just screw with the game. And then again, you know, the systems are just not good. And the net result of the combat, the maneuver in combat, the wargamey part, is no better than the area movement in Empires in Arms. It does not give you any more insight. It really doesn't. Does War and Peace? Not really. The scale of the map is still too fucking big. If you want to get insight into how these forces operated, you want to play something like the Zucker operational games. And the hex grid in this just doesn't add anything, nor does the one, I would say, nor does the one in War and Peace. The designer seems to think it does, but I don't believe him. Anyway, we will be back for the final installment, I hope. Alrighty. Hopefully this is the end. Which is the materials in the playbook. First of all, it deals with the diplomacy. Which is, again, a system that's kind of frayed around the edges. First of all, the rules, again, as with everything, are not particularly well defined. It especially breaks down if you have, like, lots of wars going on, you know, where you don't have a lot of alliances, but you have a lot of powers at war. That could end up in some really problematic situations with the chip pull. It's still allowable. The rules cover it, but not in a very appealing way. Basically, one side, you get an I go, you go within the chit pulls, essentially, which is no fun at all. It also kind of appears that you're able to, through the Entente rules, like the White Peace rules, do almost anything. You can't transfer up. So it tells you what you can't do instead of what you can do. Okay? But that kind of implies that you're allowed to do stuff. For example, give away provinces, any provinces, and shit like that. And promises that apply for a term. This is just so goofy. And then there's also like this kind of when you're within a block, which is really what the alliances are, you have this weird situation where people can vote, and not everything is clearly defined in that either. But it shows, it appears workable. I didn't feel too terribly destroyed by this in terms of its functionality. It just, I don't know. War and Peace has its very simple two-sided game, right? If you want to be at war with someone, you had to join one of the major factions, which works fine because it doesn't have Turkey in it. Turkey never really allied with France, right? But operated elsewhere. Empires in Arms, much more free, but it's complete I go, you go in a 7-player game. You've got significant differences of how the game operates, especially with the event cards, but in a lot of different ways. The victory conditions, other stuff, depending on whether or not you're playing 2 or more players. If you're playing with more players, a lot of aspects just don't work the same as they would in the 2-player game. And I'm not just talking about, basically the flow of the game and the narrative and the world is all different in a really horrendous sort of way. Now you could kind of argue the same kind of thing with War and Peace. I think it's very hard. Like, there's weird shit that can happen in War and Peace, like the French can get allies that they shouldn't be able to get, that they wouldn't be able to get in a multiplayer game. Okay, and same with Empires in Arms. But we're not talking about stuff like that. We're talking about stuff like the pace of events and the world events and just things along those lines that have nothing to do with the interactions being controlled by kind of like the diplomacy bot or whatever. Now we got a section that goes into the creation of these minor states, which is in the absolute wrong place because it needs to be in the 2-player game. I don't know why they chose to do it there. Whatever. But then we get to the weirdest thing, which is the victory conditions. And the victory conditions are really problematic in the multiplayer game. First of all, everybody has automatic victory conditions. And those automatic victory conditions kind of ruled the game and created weird situations that just don't feel right. So we had Russia going to war with Prussia early. Russia and Austria went to war with Prussia to strip territory away from it. After it was just all screwed up, starting with France getting its army, the Grand Army, stuck in Britain. But that created a peace which allowed Austria and Russia to go after Prussia and obtain things that allowed them to get close to their victory conditions. But the other weird thing is the French victory conditions in the 2-player game are a bunch of ors. It's like 4 different conditions, any one of which would win them the game. Here it's not. Here you have to have the Grand Empire. Okay, that's not a big deal. I didn't manage to get it throughout the course of the game because I never got the papacy. I think I had it at other points. Nah, I don't think I had the Hanseatic League either. But you also must have the conquest of Britain or the continental system in effect for 2 years. And those feel like kind of singular things, whereas the Grand Empire thing was kind of a nice thing in the two-player game because it gave a look. If France is able to hold on to its core area and defend itself, it wins, which kind of puts the pressure on the coalition. The other thing, though, is France is excluded from winning the two-player game if they don't have that, if they're not able to hold that core together. And that's a big deal because in these victory conditions, when you get to the end of the game, France has enough, if everybody stayed at peace or whatever, France has enough victory points as long as they aren't in the process of being conquered to win the game. They have a fair amount of victory points in their own home country, and they don't need a lot more. One of the things is that the victory points don't include a lot of places that seem kind of important. Stuff like Central Germany, West Germany, which was really, really vital, just aren't worth many points for the most part. And in fact, there aren't a lot of points anywhere. So you can hold a lot of territory that becomes unimportant. It can become difficult to gain anything. We ended up in an anomalous situation in the game that I played in which had the coalition not forced France to surrender, France would not have won. But because they forced France to surrender, a condition which would have ended the two-player game, by the way, France couldn't win the two-player game. See, this is the whole thing. It's easier for France to win the 7-player game than it is to win the 2-player game, right? Which doesn't seem reasonable. They should have like a 50-50 chance, right? The 2-player game. They should have a 1 in 7 chance in the 7-player game. I feel like they actually have a better than 50-50 chance. Certainly it's a better chance than they have of beating the coalition in the 2-player game. They have a better chance of winning it in the 7-player game. Because the coalition is less, the anti-French coalition is less likely to keep slamming into them. They have other interests and everything, which make it easier for France to win. Now, they don't have an automatic, if we hold the Grand Empire territories, we win in the 7-player game, but they don't need it. Because the victory points, especially with Paris being worth 3, make it really hard to get more points than the French have. Anyway, that's what we saw there. So, I mean, the core victory points is problematic. Now, the scenarios, I found them troublesome and painful, the setup for them and stuff, and had questions about them, but whatever. But the end point is, if this was a game that showed interesting promise, if those systems worked on their own and it was just like a bunch of errata and a bunch of problems, I can face games that the rules are problematic and that I have to make interpretations and stuff for. Empires in Arms is one of those, okay? Even though it has a huge community and there's, I guess, some sort of agreement about how things are handled, I'm not sure I agree with the agreement because I haven't looked over what people say, but I understand that some of the things that they claim should work for victory, I don't believe do. And I'm wondering if the victory condition, if I interpret the victory conditions completely different from how they do. I like how I interpret them because it ends up a very historical flavor in a lot of ways. But aside from that, um, the core systems in this game are so troubled and so problematic. Like, there's, you basically can look in any direction and find flaws. The hard thing is finding parts that look like they work at all. And even when they do, they don't work better than other games on the topic. So, you know, sort of all the core concepts in this game are at best as good as War and Peace. Okay? And there's so much trouble, you know, and it's not like there's some beautiful, you know, underlying philosophy to the game or something that just leads you in and says, damn, if only it could have been done right, you know, it would be worth the effort to try to make it. This is the problem I have with the Banana rules. The guy who designed them is like, I love this game, don't get me wrong, but the rules are a fucking mess. I don't see anything to love in it. It seems like a much, much worse version compared to War and Peace, Empires and Arms. They're both games that I feel like this kind of shares a space with. This shares a space with War and Peace in being a hex-based game where some maneuver and manipulation of you know, the sort of the operational movement type thing kind of happens. In terms of the diplomacy and what it borrows heavily from Empires and Arms. There's no question that it's got some of that flavor in it. But it does these things worse, right? And I don't see anything that shines in it at all. There's some cute little pieces, you know? The two-player game, the optional rule that I pointed out, that I didn't get to play, for the Alliance credits. That's a cute rule. I could see putting something like that in one of the other games. It's not worth the rest of this pile of garbage, though. This is a game that I mean, it feels like 3W made it, you know? But without, like, any inspiration, anything. You know, it's just, like I said before, it's a collection of kind of odd and poorly designed subsystems that don't really fit together without some grand philosophy. And just about everywhere you look, there's underlying flaws that make this game not even worth trying to save. Like, there's just nothing in it that makes me say, a little bit of a battery malfunction there. I think what I was trying to say is that there's nothing that I can say that, you know, is desirable about this game. Nothing that would make you want to fix it in any sort of way. It's not the worst game I've ever seen by any means, but it might be up there in terms of a combination of misguided in its initial goal without, you know, it just doesn't provide anything that really recommends it to be repaired or whatever. It should have been thrown in the dustbin. I very much am unhappy about the fact that at least one person, one of my viewers, thought that this was a good game and seemed to really be into it at Consim World. I don't know. He might have been playing the completely, you know, fan-based rules or whatever, as opposed to those Banania rules. thinking about back to the time that it was, I think it probably predated them. And he had said, you can't use the rules in the game. But unless they unless they completely reworked almost all the systems and just tried to keep some of the components or something, I just don't see it. Again, there's no philosophy to this game that is appealing particularly. It just feels like a patchwork of ideas that the designer thought were kind of neat without much purpose. Anyway, like I said, it's not the worst game I've ever seen, but it's hard to come up with any justification why this got a green light at any level, even if it was polished up and a workable rule set or whatever. It's cumbersome. It's not particularly historically believable. It's got things that force play that, in terms of the victory conditions and whatnot, that is just really off the rails. I mean, it forces that play, as opposed to Empires in Arms, which, I feel like there's ways of looking at Empires in Arms, at least under the victory conditions as I understand it, that seem perfectly valid. I guess the big question there comes to, hey, Britain can't really win by denying victory to other people, so they don't want to spend their points on that. That's a stupid move. But that's like one rule, and the idea of like Britain colonizing North Africa for the manpower victory points isn't that bad. Anyway, this is one of the bigger disappointments. From not covering the grand campaign to just being such a flawed and bad game in almost every aspect of it. Have I played worse games? Yes. I've played more boring games, yes. But this one just never should have been made. There were much better things out there that covered it at the same level of detail. And I don't know, man. I don't know. Not a good one. Not a good one. And yeah. All right. Bye-bye.